Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm doing part 3 of my review on One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate by Tom Segev. My first 2 reviews were on Zionism and the Jews and then the Arabs, and so this is wrapping it up. These are the 3 big players in this, and this will also, in the very end of this review, talk about the UN because they were the ones responsible for the partition proposal. But as I've said in the other 2 reviews, I can't possibly cover everything in this very long book, a very pleasurable book to read. Tom Segev is an excellent writer, takes you right into the time period and what everyone was going through. But what I'm going to try to do here, as I did in the last 2 reviews, is try to take one particular perspective, and this is the perspective of the British, and give you a sense of what they were thinking and how they were interacting with the Zionists. And what you have to realize is in this time period, there was a lot of both admiration and fear of the Jews. The British entered Palestine to defeat the Turks. They stayed there to keep it from the French, and they gave it to the Zionists because they loved the Jews even as they loathed them, at once admired and despised them, and above all feared them. The goodwill of a whole race may not be without its value. The Jewish race, Lloyd George explained in his memoirs. If you don't know who Lloyd George was, he was a prime minister of England. The Jewish race had worldwide influence and capability, and the Jews had every intention of determining the outcome of the World War, acting, he said, in accordance with their financial interests. I'm not saying this. This is what the British were saying. The Jew is aggressive, contentious, and unbridled. When they got strong enough, the Jews would crush the Arabs, expel them from their land, and get rid of the British as well. This is Lieutenant General Sir Walter Congreve, who was a British officer at the time, who commanded troops in Egypt and Palestine, and he had even expressed cordial sympathy for Zionism. But he thought that this would lead to a problem throughout the Arab world, and wow, big surprise, he was correct. This is an intelligence officer named Wyndham Deeds. One should keep in mind the link between the Jews and the Bolsheviks. This is something that was not just thought of by the British, the Americans thought this as well, because it's true. Bolshevism has an enormous link to Judaism, not Zionism, actually Judaism. And it's something that was probably a topic for a different discussion, but this was known at the time and was allowed to even be said here. The Zionists did not like the British because they wanted preferential treatment. James Pollock wrote to his father, the Jews are the most intolerant and arrogant people in the world. Again, these are British line officers serving in Palestine, sharing their reflections. In his diary, Colonel House summed up a conversation with Balfour on the subject. Balfour is inclined to believe that nearly all Bolshevism and disorder of that sort is directly traceable to Jews. I suggested putting them, or the best of them, in Palestine and holding them responsible for the orderly behavior of Jews throughout the world. Balfour thought the plan had possibilities. So here we have this idea that, of course, Bolshevism is directly traceable to the Jews, and we should put them all there so that we can encourage them to, I don't know, have orderly behavior for the Jews. This is Balfour. This is the one who wrote the Balfour Declaration. This is someone who was, let's say, amenable to Jews, but he still knew that Bolshevism and the great evil of communism had at its heart Jewish influence. And we know that with the death of the Tsar, this was something that directly was traceable and bragged about by the Jews, commemorated. They were the ones who helped. I think there's a newspaper clipping. I'm trying to remember where I saw this. There's a newspaper clipping celebrating the murder of the Tsar, commemorated by Zionists. This is a court of inquiry at the time of the riots in Jerusalem. When was this? What year was this? There were riots in Jerusalem all the time. This is early on. This is Nebi Musa that they're referring to. Would this have been in the 20s? Yeah, I think Nebi Musa was 1920, I want to say. The court ruled Bolshevism flowed in Zionism's inner heart, the court stated. Many of the Jews coming to settle in Palestine brought Bolshevik views with them. So what's interesting is the British thought and knew that Bolshevism was directly tied to Judaism, but they still thought it would be a good idea to put Zionists in charge of this new Jewish state, and maybe they would go down there and make those bad Bolshevik Jews behave. I mean, this is all in black and white, so it isn't as if this is some conspiracy theory. Here's an Israeli historian, Tom Segev, writing about all this. Going back to this quote from the Balfour Declaration, this deserves to be repeated over and over. I don't know how many times I'll repeat this phrase through all of the times I'll be reviewing these books, but it always needs to be repeated. Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is a far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Arnold Balfour in the Balfour Declaration. Remember, Zionism always matters more than the Palestinians. The declaration did not refer to a Jewish state, but a national home. The phrase was a Zionist invention promulgated in the First Zionist Congress and intended to camouflage Zionism's true intention so as to mitigate opposition. And that's the reality of it. If you had come out and said, we want our own independent state, it would have been resisted. But by using a term like the national home, oh, maybe it's just a small area, it's a little canton, it's a district. Again, the wording incorporated the various objections raised during the debate, reflected all-around caution. Thus, it did not say that Palestine would become the national home of the Jews, but that the national home would be established in Palestine, in other words, only in part of it. Look at how careful the wording is. And finally, here was one nation promising another nation the land of a third nation, wrote Arthur Kessler, who dismissed the declaration as an impossible notion. Great phrase. Here was one nation promising another nation the land of a third nation. That is the Balfour Declaration in a nutshell. So what did the British line officers serving in Palestine think? We've talked about some of them already. Overall, the army did not reject Zionism as an idea, or on moral or political grounds, but felt that Britain's support for the movement was liable to complicate matters in Palestine, and warned the government in London. As a rule, however, the army considered the government's policy on a Jewish national home an order to be carried out. In keeping with the policy dictated by London, the army reluctantly recognized the Commission, which is the Zionist Commission, as representative of the entire Jewish community, as if the Zionist movement were the exclusive agent of Jewish nationalism. Thus, the Commission was empowered to collect taxes from the Jewish agricultural settlements, an important political achievement. You have to realize that the British during the Mandate gave the Zionists every opportunity to basically prepare to become a country by establishing institutions like this, collecting taxes. That's one of the most basic forms, basic powers of any government, the power to tax. And this was just a representative organization of some of the Jews. The Zionists couldn't be said to represent all Jews, and yet the Arabs, the Palestinians, were not given these same concessions. Captain James Pollock considered going home. No really self-respecting Britisher can stay here, he wrote to his father. Britain may be about to commit the greatest injustice that has ever been done by any nation in modern times. All faith in British honesty and justice has gone from the Arab of the Near East. The country would be handed over to the Jews, despite the wishes of the Arabs. Churchill and Samuel both acknowledged to Wiseman that most British officials could not be counted sympathetic to Zionism. The policy of the Balfour Declaration is an unjust policy, one of them, Charles Robert Ashby, stated, quoting George Adam Smith's Historical Geography of the Holy Land, "Palestine is emphatically a land of tribes. The idea that it can ever belong to one nation, even though this were the Jews, is contrary to both nature and the scripture." Interesting. Alex Morrison. Ostensibly, the British had been sent to Palestine to keep the peace and punish terrorists, Arabs and Jews. In practice, the authorities discriminated in favor of the Jews, never punishing Jewish terrorists with the severity they used on the Arabs. He thought this was not right. The Arabs always seemed to get a raw deal, he wrote. And that goes on to the present day, does it not? These two quotes that I'm going to read are particularly heartbreaking because you realize what could have been had a different action been taken. The British neglected Arab education because they did not want to finance it and feared its political effect. So if I teach children to read, they may gain a consciousness about what is going on. If they gain a consciousness about what's going on, they might do something about it. Another comment. This reverence for exams was doubly absurd because after 30 years of ruling Palestine, the British had still not instituted compulsory school attendance. Education standards differed for city and village children and for boys and girls, and only 3 out of every 10 school. The other 7, mostly in the villages, grew up illiterate. They were a lost generation. The result of this loss for the Arab community was catastrophic. A nationwide system of education would have forged national cohesion. But the War of 1948 found the Arabs rent by regional, social, and economic divisions, with profound differences between city dwellers and villagers. The Hebrew education system, by contrast, formed the Jews into a national community, prepared them for their war of independence, and led them to victory. Had Britain limited its support for Zionism to nothing other than perpetuating Arab illiteracy, His Majesty's government could still claim to have kept the promise enshrined in the Balfour Declaration. Wow. I mean, what a great point. And once more underscoring the importance of the ability to read. And was it Mark Twain that said that the difference between somebody who can't read and doesn't read is nothing? There's no difference. Just because you possess the ability to read, if you don't use it, then you might as well be illiterate. And unfortunately, these children were never even given that chance. So these last quotes are talking about partition, obviously, and at some point the British were tired of their own incompetence in Palestine and decided to just give this over to the UN. The UN could deal with it, and they weren't going to bother with it anymore. And obviously the Zionists, as they always do, were very successful politically and lobbied everybody to vote for partition because that was a first step for them. They weren't going to be content with partition. They wanted everything, but they thought partition would be a good start. There were Jews who opposed partition as well. Revisionist hawks would not agree to give up the territories assigned to the Arabs. The binationalist doves decried the principle of separation, believing in one or another form of coexistence. The Zionist movement accepted the partition plan in a wise tactical step. Even then, all the players understood that geographically and demographically, the UN's partition plan could not be implemented. The border between the two states was long and contorted, impossible to defend. The Jewish state would include more than 500,000 Arabs, slightly more than the number of Jews then living within the proposed boundaries. Some 10,000 Jews, including the inhabitants of the city of Nahariya, would find themselves within the Arab boundaries. Furthermore, there was no reason to trust that international control of Jerusalem was viable. No one believed in the UN's map. Everyone knew there would be war. The proposal was passed by a majority of 33, including the United States and the USSR, against 13, with 10 abstentions, including Britain. The victory was largely due to the work of the Zionist lobby. David Lloyd George would not have been surprised. He had always known that the Jews controlled the world. Sir Henry Gurney, the chief secretary, followed and analyzed the components of the Zionist movement's propaganda carefully. His analysis was hostile, but not unintelligent. He noted that the Zionists had successfully equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Does that sound familiar? Are you paying attention? Gurney supposed that the Americans would have been unenthusiastic about helping the Jews had they wanted to establish an independent state in New York. The pressures the Zionist creates, he wrote, makes the world hate him, but apparently he does not care. He has a suicidal urge. That was what made him so desperate and self-centered. Okay, that ends this 3-part review of One Palestine Complete. If you enjoyed this review, maybe go back and watch the other 2 reviews. They'll help you get a more complete picture of this book. It's a pleasure to read. As I said, it's 500 pages. It's one of the longest ones I've read in learning about the Palestinian issue. If you want to buy a copy, there's a link below. That's one way you can support the channel. Another way, as always, is to like, subscribe, share this with friends who are interested in actually learning more about the history of what's going on, to better understand what's going on now. If you understand the history of it, you will better understand it. You won't necessarily be able to prevent what's happening from happening, but you'll see it all in context. It will make sense to you more and more. The more history I learn, the more what is happening now makes sense to me, because it's all happened before and it continues to happen effectively. You can support this work even more by becoming a member of my Patreon or my YouTube members. Those people get access to early reviews of these videos, and a portion of the proceeds of any of those memberships goes towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which helps to support the medical operations for children in Palestine who could not otherwise get access to that. And they've been doing a tremendous job they've been doing a tremendous job for many years, but they've been doing a particularly tremendous job recently, and I want to commend them for that. So if you'd like to support them, you can do so directly at the link in the description, or you can support my work and send a super thanks, for example, and a portion of that is going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. As always, enjoy your reading.